of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here on this very important occasion and on the issues of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. I'll brief today, if I may, on the widespread death, destruction, displacement, and suffering caused by this senseless war, ongoing humanitarian operations, and the challenges that the humanitarian community continues to face. Over 14 million people remain forcibly displaced from their homes in Ukraine, including 6.5 million internally displaced in Ukraine, and over 7.8 million across Europe. According to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as of the 1st of December, 17,023 civilians have been killed since 24th of February 2022, including 419 children. However, I think we all know that the real toll is far greater. WHO reports at least 715 attacks on healthcare in the country, including 630 that impacted health facilities and 61 that affected personnel. These attacks in Ukraine represent more than 70% of all attacks on health infrastructure in the world. Since February, 1,148 children have been killed or injured, while millions have fled, uprooted from their homes, separated from their families, or put at risk of violence. And Madam President, of course, winter has now arrived in Ukraine. Temperatures are already below freezing and are expected to drop to below -20 degrees Celsius. The attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including power stations and heating plants, have left millions of people without access to heat, electricity, and water, adding another dangerous dimension to the humanitarian crisis caused by the war. As a result of the attacks on civilian infrastructure, people are being deprived of healthcare and children deprived of education. In Ukraine today, the ability of civilians to survive is under attack. Amid freezing temperatures and destruction, people at the highest risk are already vulnerable, among them the elderly, those with disabilities, and the many millions displaced to which I referred earlier, essentially because of a lack of basic services. International humanitarian law speaks for itself. Objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population must be protected. Constant care must be taken to spare civilians and civilian objects throughout all military operations. Gender-based violence, targeting women and girls, continues to be pervasive, and we are very clear underreported. Madam President, our work is to safeguard lives and preserve dignity. The humanitarian community is committed still to stay and deliver, and almost 690 humanitarian organizations, partners, the majority of which are local frontline organizations, have and continue to provide life-critical aid and protection to 13.5 million people in Ukraine. And I don't apologize for this stream of really terrifying statistics. These people in the 690 humanitarian agencies continue to work against the clock to support civilians. And over the past few months in that context, in preparation for the winter, humanitarians have provided more than 630,000 civilians with different kinds of direct winter assistance, and 400 generators have been distributed to critical facilities. Since October, the sustained attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have created a new level of need that impacts the whole country and exacerbates and increases the needs caused by the war. The scale of the destruction of the electrical and heating infrastructure requires the international community's enhanced support to the government of Ukraine beyond what humanitarians can provide. And indeed, there are discussions to this end in Kyiv and elsewhere. In recent weeks, more areas have become accessible in eastern and southern oblasts, allowing humanitarians to reach entirely new communities with assistance, and we're grateful for this. Our teams are responding. Interagency convoys are moving to bring aid to areas where Ukraine has recently regained control. In Kherson, for example, convoys have delivered much-needed drinking water, potable water for thousands of civilians, medical supplies to treat 100,000 people for up to 3 months, and assistance for women and girls' reproductive health. And food assistance has been delivered in Kherson for nearly 100,000 civilians. Humanitarians working to respond to gender-based violence, including in particular local women's organizations, also are seeking to scale up the delivery of essential services for their clients. An integrated network of spaces and providers has been delivering survivor-centered services for women and girls, boys and men who have been subject to gender-based violence. And these efforts and activities, which began at the beginning of the war, continue. 765,000 children. It's very difficult to imagine this. 765,000 children have received psychosocial support to help them deal with the effects of war and displacement. Mobile teams are operating in centers for internally displaced and identifying, registering, assessing, and providing direct support to children with protection needs. None of this would be possible without the unprecedented member state and other donor support to the Ukraine Flash Appeal. And to date, we have received, as a result of that generosity, $3.1 billion of the $4.3 billion requested through the end of this year. To date, we have transferred almost $1 billion in humanitarian cash transfers to about 4.3 million people. Cash as a mode of delivery has come to its maturity in the case of the tragic events in Ukraine. More must be done, of course, to continue to close the funding shortfall, and we will soon be issuing plans for 2023. While there have been improvements, as I've said, in humanitarian access, the biggest challenge remains impediments to reaching areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Discussions continue between the UN and the parties to facilitate unimpeded access in those areas. It's vital that we get the convoys through to deliver relief items. OCHA has, as we have discussed in this chamber, a presence in Moscow, and I continue personally to engage key interlocutors for access in Moscow, in Kyiv, and in meetings elsewhere. Today, of the 13.5 million people who have been reached with assistance since February, 1 million of them are in areas outside government of Ukraine control. They have been reached thanks to humanitarian partners positioned still in areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, where humanitarian operations had begun, of course, since 2014 as a result of the invasion. While we continue to provide support in these regions through these local partners, and there are still international staff in those areas, our response is neither regular nor at the right scale. Under IHL, again, all parties should allow, facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure that their personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. In areas where the government of Ukraine has recently regained control, the presence of landmines and explosive remnants of war is a major concern for communities and, of course, for humanitarians who serve them, and causes delay and impediments for the restoration of essential services, including electricity. States must bolster their support for clearance to prevent further casualties of these mines. This will ensure quicker, more effective access to livelihoods and essential services. And information on mines and used or abandoned explosive ordnance should be shared by those who know at the earliest possible time. Madam President, last week in Geneva, I launched the Global Humanitarian Overview, which is our annual assessment of global humanitarian needs for next year and how to respond to them. At the beginning of 2022, 274 million people needed humanitarian assistance. For 2023, the projected number has grown to 339 million, from 274 million to 339 million, an increase of about 24%. 65 million people have arrived at our doorstep, 1 in 23 people on this planet. And as we have said publicly, that's a population the size of the third most populous country in the world. This is a record appeal, and it would be difficult to get them adequate funding, but it's a stark reminder of how fast humanitarian needs are accelerating. And this is especially true for Ukraine. So I end partly about Ukraine, of course, and the urgent needs that we see as we move into winter, and as we see the damage to infrastructure, and as we see the potential for more displacement. But I place that within that larger context of a world gone mad, which sees 1 in 23 people in need of humanitarian assistance around the globe. It's a picture which is unimaginable. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the